Hello, everyone. My name is Anna. I was born to loving parents, Robert and Lisa Anderson, in a small suburban town. My dad was a journalist, and my mom worked as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was pretty normal until I turned 15, and then suddenly, everything changed. It was a rainy Friday evening when my parents were driving home from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandmother, watching some silly cartoon when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that went through me when I heard my grandmother crying softly in the kitchen. The next few days were a blur. They told us my mom had died instantly in the crash. My dad survived, but just barely. When I finally saw him in the hospital, he was just a shadow of the man I once knew. His legs were crushed, and the doctor said he'd never walk again. "Anna," he whispered, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry." I didn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault. A drunk driver had crashed into their car. But as I got older, I realized he was sorry for what our lives had become, for the struggles we would face, for the mother I had lost, and for the father he thought he could no longer be. But my dad, Robert Anderson, was stronger than he gave himself credit for. After he got out of the hospital and adjusted to life in a wheelchair, he threw himself into his work. He had always been a talented writer, and now he focused all his energy on his job as an editor at the city's major newspaper. As I entered my teenage years, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, make friends, and have as normal a life as possible. But the truth was, I preferred spending time with him. We watched old movies together, argued about books, and he helped me with my homework. When it was time for college, Dad insisted that I go away to school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." I was hesitant, but I knew he was right, so I went off to college. I attended the University of Pennsylvania and studied accounting. That's where I met Sophie, who became my best friend. Through Sophie, I met her second cousin, Ethan. Ethan was kind and funny, and he didn't flinch when I told him about my dad. In fact, the first time he met Dad, they got along right away, bonding over their shared love of classic rock. Later, Ethan told me, "Your dad is cool, and you're amazing for taking care of him all these years." I tried to play it off, but inside, I was glowing. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life, a life with love, laughter, and even a family of my own someday. After graduation, things started to fall into place like a puzzle. I got a job at a local tax service, and Ethan started working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 4 years before he proposed to me on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was thrilled, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. "Yes, Ethan, but I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Ethan smiled wide and said, "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. As I stood there holding Ethan's hand, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Margaret, and my sister-in-law, Emily. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Margaret asked during our first meeting, wrinkling her nose like she smelled something bad. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to stay calm. "But he works as an editor?" "How nice," she interrupted, clearly not interested. Then she turned to Ethan and asked, "Are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but Ethan immediately defended me. "Mom, Anna is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters." That shut Margaret up, but I could still see the disapproval in her eyes. Emily, following her mother's lead, was just as cold toward me. After the wedding, true to his word, Ethan moved in with Dad and me, and our life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office while Ethan was on the road for days at a time. When he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Margaret and Emily visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They acted like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once I overheard Margaret whispering to Emily, "It's a shame. Ethan could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I kept quiet for Ethan's sake. I tried to keep the peace, but it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Margaret and Emily, I broke down in tears. Ethan found me in our bedroom, crying. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I sobbed. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Ethan's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." His words comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Margaret and Emily. As the months went by, Ethan's trucking business began to grow. He was always on the road, traveling across the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I focused on my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Ethan called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Anna, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I liked the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted. "And it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place. A spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary, but with Ethan's income, mine, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Sunday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in and making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air. It was peaceful, almost perfect. Then we decided to have a housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and, yes, even Margaret and Emily. The party was in full swing when they showed up, fashionably late as usual. They walked in, looking around with barely hidden envy. As we walked through the house, I could see Margaret calculating something. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Anna," she said quietly, "this would be perfect for Ethan and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me?" I managed to say. "Oh, don't look so shocked," Margaret continued. "Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition." Before I could respond, Margaret marched out to the patio, where Dad was talking with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him toward the driveway. "Margaret," I shouted, running after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors." I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Ethan heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. "Mom," he yelled, "what the hell are you doing? Let go of Robert's chair right now." Margaret looked shocked by Ethan's tone. "But honey, I was just—" "I don't want to hear it," Ethan cut her off. "You and Emily need to leave, now." After they left, Ethan apologized over and over to Dad and me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would do that. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted Ethan's hand. "It's not your fault, son," he said gently. "Some people just can't understand." Life settled into a new routine after that incident. Margaret and Emily kept their distance, which was fine with me. Ethan focused on his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help pay for our new home. I split my time between my job at the tax office, taking care of our home, and looking after Dad. 4 years passed quickly. Our life became comfortable and predictable. Ethan was on the road most of the time, but when he was home, our little family was happy, Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. A man's unfamiliar voice greeted me. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Officer Henderson from the Highway Patrol." My heart sank. "Yes?" I barely managed to say. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Ethan Brooks, has been in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and "didn't make it" floated around me, but I couldn't understand them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that the reality began to hit me. Ethan was gone. The next week was a fog of grief and disbelief. I went through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely understanding what was happening. The day before the funeral, I gathered my courage and called Margaret. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from a newspaper obituary. "Hello," Margaret's sharp voice answered. "Margaret, it's Anna," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Ethan. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then, to my shock, Margaret's voice came back, dripping with anger. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You made him work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son." I was stunned. "Margaret, Save it," she snapped. "I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it." The line went dead. I stood there, foam in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Ethan's funeral was gray and rainy, matching my mood perfectly. The church was full. Ethan was well liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had come to pay their respects. After the service, as people passed by to offer their condolences, I noticed that Margaret and Emily were nowhere to be seen. They hadn't even bothered to show